far in this unit, reproduction, what we've really focused on in the first section was cell reproduction. How cells reproduce themselves, mitosis, meiosis. Then from there we moved in a little bit to fertilization and the development of the embryo and so forth. So the next part of this unit is a little bit about actual human reproduction. So we'll talk about male and female reproductive systems. A fair amount of this will be reviewed from probably 7th grade, but there will be some more added detail. And then we'll talk about development of the fetus, birth, and we'll go from there. So start with the male reproductive system. So the male reproductive system is composed of the testes and associated glands. And so the testes, as we know, produce sperm cells. And also hormones, testosterone, the male reproductive hormone. And the testes are where sperm are produced, where they mature before being released. So males produce new sperm cells from puberty till their death. And they're produced in the testes in a part of the testes called the seminiferous tubules. This is where meiosis takes place. These are where cells that were diploid go through the process of meiosis to produce cells that are haploid, that have half the number of chromosomes. Okay? Spermatogenesis, gametogenesis we would call this. Okay? And so this happens in the testes, in the seminiferous tubules. Then these sperm that are produced, they are immature. They're not yet, not have all the parts, they're not active, they're not able yet to fertilize an egg cell. So these sperm cells that are immature move to the exterior of the testes to an organ called the epididymis, which stores these sperm cells until they finish maturing. The testes are held outside of the body in the scrotum, pouch of skin that keeps them at a slightly cooler temperature. The testes need to be about 1 or 2 degrees cooler than body temperature to produce sperm efficiently. Okay? And the testes, they start in the abdominal cavity, okay? And then usually around the end of development or the beginning of birth, they descend into the scrotum from inside of the abdomen. So the testes, as they produce these sperm cells, we know that's the male gamete. Sperm cells, in comparison to an egg cell, is very, very small. The egg cell is 90,000 times larger than a single sperm cell. And so the sperm cells travel from the testes into the epididymis, and then they're released from the epididymis into a long tube that goes through the scrotum up into the abdomen. It's called the vas deferens. Okay? The vas deferens merges with the urethra to carry the sperm out of the body. Do you know the name of the surgery man can have if they no longer ever want to be able to make a woman pregnant? Vasectomy. And it's basically cutting the vas deferens so that sperm cells that are produced in the testes cannot get out of the man's body, therefore he can't make a woman pregnant. The male releases millions of sperm cells. 40 to 300 million sperm cells are released at once. They can survive, they can live for, depending, 24 to 48 hours. Okay? And the sperm cells on their own would not be able to do their job and fertilize the egg. Okay? They need extra fluids, nutrients to allow them to reach the egg, and that combination of those fluids is called semen. And it's produced along the way in several different glands. There's obviously the prostate gland is one you've heard of, because prostate cancer is one of the most common forms of cancer that affects men, especially as they get older. My father had prostate cancer, my grandfather had prostate cancer. It's very common. And it's cancer. It's when the cells of the prostate gland itself become cancerous. They start to grow and divide uncontrollably. That's what all cancer is. So it's very common in men. Prostate gland, its purpose is to produce fluid to add to the semen that is alkaline in nature, that is basic. And the purpose of that is because the fluids in the vagina are acidic. And so the combining of an alkaline semen helps neutralize that acid to allow these sperm cells to stay alive. The Cowper's gland is another one that provides fluid for the sperm. The seminal vesicle secretes fluid that has nutrients in it, fructose. Okay, it's a type of sugar that the sperm can use as nourishment to provide energy because they have to make a long journey. They have to make their way all the way to the oviduct in order to find that egg. So they need energy to do that. And during ejaculation, during sex, sperm are released from the penis into the vagina where they can start that journey. If we look at the female reproductive system, the equivalent to testes in the female are the ovaries. They produce egg cells. They also, this is wrong, okay? They produce, I should say, estrogen and progesterone. So change testosterone to estrogen. I think I copied it from the previous slide and didn't change that. So, estrogen is the female sex hormone. It's responsible for the development of female secondary sex characteristics, also responsible for various stages of the menstrual cycle, the reproductive cycle that we'll talk about today. Ovaries are in the lower abdomen. They're about 1 inch in diameter. There's two, a right ovary and a left ovary. And as we've said before, they contain all of the immature eggs at birth. And so no new eggs will ever be formed, which is different than it is in males. And the ovaries produce hormones that help regulate the menstrual cycle and the development of secondary female sex characteristics. So these egg cells that are present in the ovaries, they're the female gamete. So in the ovaries is where oogenesis takes place, gametogenesis in the females. And these egg cells are in a little sort of cavity inside of the ovary. It's called a follicle. And after puberty, once every reproductive cycle, one of these follicles matures. And the egg inside of it matures. And eventually it breaks open, releasing the egg, and that's what we call ovulation, the release of an egg from an ovary. And that egg's released from the ovary, travels through the oviduct or fallopian tube to the uterus. And that's where it can be fertilized. In the oviduct is where an egg cell can be fertilized by a sperm cell. The uterus is a sort of muscular sac that will hold the embryo if it does implant and grow into a fetus. That will happen inside of the uterus. We might call it the womb. Remember, the baby's not inside of the mother's stomach. That's a horrible place for a fetus. It's filled with hydrochloric acid and wouldn't be good. So it's in the uterus. And the opening of the uterus that will eventually allow the fetus out is the cervix. We'll talk more about childbirth later on, but that's what dilates. Have you ever heard of a woman dilating during labor and delivery? It's the cervix that has to sort of open up to allow the fetus out during childbirth. And the cervix leads to the vagina, muscular tube. This is where sperm are deposited during intercourse. Serves also as a passageway for the fetus to be born in a natural childbirth. During intercourse, 200 to 300 million sperm can be released by the man into the vagina. But out of all of those hundreds of millions of sperm cells, only a few dozen actually make it to the egg cell. So they have to make their way from the vagina, through the cervix, through the uterus, into the fallopian tubes to reach an egg cell. They're attracted by different chemicals that the egg releases. But out of those hundreds of millions of sperm, many of them are not functioning sperm. Many of them sort of get lost along the way. Some of them die along the way. Some go up the wrong oviduct. So not that many actually reach the egg cell, only 50 or so to fertilize it. And actually only one single sperm cell will fertilize the egg cell. As soon as one sperm cell enters the outer layer of the egg, it instantly sort of switches and becomes impermeable to any other sperm cells, because obviously it's important that just a single sperm cell fertilize a single egg cell to maintain proper chromosome numbers. So if we look sort of at the organs, we have the ovaries, one on each side. They're attached to the fallopian tube. Now, the fallopian tube sort of doesn't connect right to the ovary, has these fimbriae, which sort of have cilia inside them that guide the egg into the oviduct. It travels into the uterus, the opening of which is the cervix, and then the vagina. This is an actual microscopic image of an egg cell. See there? The lining of the uterus is called the endometrium. That surrounds the inside. That's what becomes enriched with blood vessels and thickens as the woman's body is getting ready for an egg to implant. Which brings us to that reproductive cycle. The menstrual cycle or reproductive cycle is quite complex, and it's governed by a series of hormones. So it's an endocrine cycle. It relies on feedback, negative feedback between several hormones working on different glands that produce these hormones. So it is pretty complex, and we'll go through sort of the basics and get a little more into a little more detail in the next couple of slides. So the menstrual cycle, it takes about 28 days or so. Starts at puberty, which puberty can, the onset of puberty can go from anywhere from 8 years of age in a woman to 16 or 17 or even 18 years old. It varies from woman to woman. And it eventually does end. So unlike males, which will produce sperm cells throughout their entire lifetime, from puberty on, males will produce sperm cells. Women, however, will not ovulate, will not have a reproductive cycle throughout their lifetime. Okay? It stops at the time that we call menopause, which again can vary, but time from in the mid-40s to 50s, late 50s is when menopause happens, and that's basically the end of the reproductive cycle, the end of ovulation in a woman. And so the reproductive cycle, menstrual cycle, has 4 sort of stages that we break it down into. And the length of these stages, the length of the menstrual cycle in general, can vary quite a bit. It can be irregular, and it can be, 28 days from one ovulation to another, or it might be 35 days. And sometimes it may vary from month to month. It depends on lots of things: illness, pregnancy, stress, nutrition. All of these things can affect the menstrual cycle and when it happens and how long it happens. So if we start, it is a cycle, so it repeats over and over again, so you can sort of start wherever you want. But we'll start in what we call the follicle stage, which lasts for about 10 to 14 days. In the follicle stage, the pituitary gland is producing a hormone we call FSH. It stands for follicle stimulating hormone. And what follicle stimulating hormone, obviously released into the blood like all hormones, and it stimulates the ovaries, the follicles within those ovaries to start to mature, to start to grow. So remember, inside of the ovaries are these immature follicles with immature eggs in them, hundreds of them. Once FSH levels increase, it stimulates one of those follicles to start to grow, okay? Start to release. And as that follicle grows, it releases its own hormones. The follicles release estrogen. Okay? And so estrogen enters the bloodstream. The effects of estrogen are to allow, there's many effects, but one of the important ones is to allow the lining of the uterus to start to thicken. It signals the endometrium to start to thicken, start to be enriched with blood vessels. Again, preparing for a pregnancy. That's the purpose of this. Around the 14th day, we reach the ovulation stage. Okay? As estrogen levels are increasing because the follicle is growing and developing, that has a negative feedback, okay, with the pituitary gland. It starts to slow down FSH production because, again, the follicle has grown. Okay? And it starts to increase production of the next hormone. It's called luteinizing hormone, LH. And so the combination of these hormones, LH, FSH, and estrogen, signal to the follicle to open up and release this egg into the oviduct. And that's what happens. The combination of these hormones leads to the follicle releasing its egg. That's ovulation. This is a time when a woman can become pregnant. She's just released an egg into the oviduct, and so that's when it can be fertilized by sperm cell. Okay, there's a window of time after ovulation in which that egg can become fertilized. That follicle then turns into, it released its egg, but that little bubble of a follicle is still there. And it turns into something called a corpus luteum. Okay? And it produces this sort of yellowish mass within the ovary. Okay? And it secretes its own hormones. The hormones produced by the corpus luteum is called progesterone. And progesterone prevents new follicles from forming, and it keeps the lining of the uterus intact and thickened. So it's, again, this corpus luteum is sending this progesterone saying, all right, keep the lining of the uterus intact, getting ready for implantation. But if there is no implantation, if there's no embryo present, if no fertilization happens, then this progesterone level inhibits LH, and progesterone starts to decrease. The lining of the uterus becomes thinner and eventually breaks down. And so at the end of this cycle, about the 28th day, the lining of the uterus, the endometrium, pulls away from the walls of the uterus. And the egg that was never fertilized, along with the lining of the uterus, is shed through the vagina, and that's what the menstrual period is. Sort of removing the lining of the uterus that was not needed. There was no pregnancy, so the lining is no longer needed. It's removed, leaves the woman's body through the vagina, and that's what the period is. And then this whole cycle sort of resets. And in the next reproductive cycle, these hormones all kick in again, cause ovulation to happen, thicken the lining of the uterus to get ready for the fertilized egg. If it doesn't happen, again, menstruation. If it does happen, though, if the egg is fertilized, this whole process sort of stops. Okay? That progesterone levels stay elevated. The lining of the uterus stays thickened because it's supporting an embryo that's growing, a fetus that's growing. And a woman won't get her period throughout all of her pregnancy. You know, one of the first signs a woman may know she's pregnant is she doesn't get her period. Probably before she feels any different, really. She may not get her period, and that may be a signal to her that maybe she's pregnant, because normally, if there was no embryo there, she would get her period. We have a bunch of slides now that sort of go through and sort of show this in a few different ways. And this is similar to the lab you're going to be doing today. If we look sort of at this diagram on the left, what we see is the levels of the different hormones in all these different colors. We see how they rise and fall throughout the reproductive cycle. Okay? We also see here body temperature changes. As a woman goes through her typical menstrual cycle, her body temperature changes. In fact, some women that are trying to become pregnant will take their temperature every single day and record it. And they can, after a couple months, see their body temperature. They can see when they have this spike in their body temperature, that's the time when they're ovulating. And so if they're trying to get pregnant, that's the time when they're going to have sex to try to have an egg get fertilized. So you can. They also have like a pregnancy test, a urine pregnancy test. You know, a woman when she is pregnant, different chemicals in her urine and her blood change, and so she can have a urine test. Get the little test thing in there, and it'll tell if she's pregnant or not. They have a similar kind of test to tell when she's ovulating or not. Okay, it's a test using urine that tells her when she's ovulating in case she's trying to get pregnant. Here you see what's happening in the ovary as time goes on, as the reproductive cycle goes on. with ovulation about halfway through the cycle. Here we have the follicle that's growing, the egg that's maturing, and then we have the corpus luteum stage after the egg's released. That's what this is. And we see the changes in the lining of the uterus as well. Here is a diagram that shows sort of the hormones that are produced. I think the next page is a little bit better, so we'll look at that one. But what this diagram is trying to show is sort of the inhibition and the stimulation these hormones have. It's a very complex system where certain hormones stimulate glands to produce other hormones, others inhibit various hormones, so it's quite a complex process. And we'll talk a little bit more about it later, but women can take synthetic hormones, synthetic estrogen or progesterone, and that's what birth control pills are. They are a woman giving herself various hormones to not ovulate, so that her ovaries are not producing egg and therefore she can't become pregnant. This diagram is sort of the simpler one, but we have here obviously, what gland is this?
Pituitary.
That's the pituitary. Again, it gets signals from the hypothalamus. These steps are sort of numbered here. So again, the pituitary gland produces a couple hormones, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Those hormones stimulate a follicle within an ovary to start to grow. Okay? As that follicle grows, okay, it starts to produce estrogen, which has some negative feedback here. Okay? So it inhibits then the production of FSH. As it grows even larger, estrogen levels peak even more. This follicle produces more estrogen, which has feedback into the pituitary gland, positive feedback, which causes a surge in LH and FSH. And that surge, when we look back here, that surge in these hormones, that's the signal to the ovary to release the egg. Right? And the follicle breaks open, releasing the egg cell. That follicle then turns into the corpus luteum. Okay? That stays in the ovary. Okay? It inhibits the production of FSH and LH and increases the production of estrogen and progesterone. This shows basically the same sort of thing with pretty detailed explanation, but the process is the same. And again, if you look on this slide, it's all numbered in the steps. It may look like super complicated, but when you really look at the steps, it's not as complicated. So we have the hypothalamus up here in the brain producing the hormone. It's called gonadotropin releasing hormone. It goes to the pituitary gland, causing FSH to be produced. So first that we have the GnRH. That produces FSH, step number 2, which causes the follicle in the ovary to start to mature. Okay. So then we have the follicle in the ovary as it matures, produces estrogen. Okay. Okay. Estrogen has negative feedback here. It slows down FSH, starts LH. And again, you see the follicle growing. See the egg inside of it. Okay, that estrogen also prepares the lining of the uterus. So this estrogen being produced in the follicle has an inhibitory effect in the brain, but also has an effect in the uterus, causing the lining of the uterus to start to thicken. Okay? That surge of LH, luteinizing hormone, causes ovulation to take place. Okay? Ovulation happens. The corpus luteum forms. Okay? Again, we have that feedback, slowing LH and thickening the uterus. Okay? And then as that breaks down, eventually the lining of the uterus stays thickened as long as the embryo is present. If it's not, it starts to break down and we have the menstrual period. And all that's sort of described here. So, if an egg is released, all these steps happen. The menstrual cycle takes place. Ovulation takes place. If at that time there are sperm present, then a sperm cell can meet the egg cell and fertilization is taking place. Usually happens up high in the oviduct. So again, those sperm are released in the vagina, but they need to make their way all the way to the oviduct. Has to occur within about a day. Okay? Otherwise, the egg starts to break down. So there's a window of time in which this can take place. If it is fertilized, if a sperm cell reaches the egg and a single sperm cell enters, then that, what would we call that first cell? A zygote. And it starts to divide by what process? Mitosis. Okay? And it forms 2 cells. And then those cells each split. They form 4 cells and so on. Now those initial cells, how would you describe them? The 4-cell and 8-cell stage.
Give me like the name of it?
Yeah, well, sort of.
And where are you
Yeah, but what are those cells like?
though? Oh.
Okay, they would be embryonic stem cells, so they are undifferentiated. What does that mean? Or
They're exactly the same. They turn into any cell.
they're identical. They have no function yet. They all are identical basically. They are undifferentiated. Later on in development, they'll start to take on different roles, and some will go on to become parts of the endoderm or the mesoderm or ectoderm, and start to become various organs. But in the initial stages, they're all the same. They're undifferentiated. And those first stages of cell division, we call that cleavage. And cleavage is the division of that embryo into several cells. And it happens, like you guys just said, through mitosis. After about 6 or 7 days, that embryo will have made its way all the way through the fallopian tube. So relatively slowly. Along the way, it's been divided. Move into the uterus, okay, and implant. Basically, the lining of the uterus has been thickened because of the effects of estrogen and progesterone. The embryo will implant there. It will attach, okay, and it'll continue its development. Gastrulation happens. What does that mean? Gastrulation,
It
what?
forms like the 3 layers of the
Yes, and there's, it goes from hollow ball cells to what? There are different layers, but something else forms.
like that, the gastrulation.
Yeah,
like
the indentation, the gastrulation is the indentation of sort of a tube that will sort of run through that organism, okay? Several extra embryonic membranes form, sort of layers around the embryo, okay? They don't become part of the actual embryo, they're outside to support it. The chorion, which will eventually become the placenta. It grows into the lining of the uterus with these villi, these tiny little projections. And again, that's where diffusion of material is going to happen. That's where material from the mother's blood will diffuse into the blood of the embryo, the fetus. The amnion is the membrane surrounding the fetus, filled with amniotic fluid to protect and cushion the embryo as it grows. There's a very small yolk sac, even in placental mammals. This yolk sac's main function is to help make the blood cells until other organs mature. It's not really, it doesn't really provide nutrition for that growing embryo. It's to provide those blood cells. The umbilical cord forms, which connects the placenta to the embryo. That umbilical cord has 2 arteries, okay, and 1 vein to transport blood from the embryo to the placenta and back. Now, there are some times when a couple that wants to have a child have difficulty doing so. There's a whole host of reasons why. Okay, could be due to a lack of sperm production in the male, could be hormone problems in the woman, could be she's not ovulating, could be that a whole host of different things. And so sometimes after treatment with various more conservative measures, a couple may choose to have what's called in vitro fertilization. In vitro fertilization, they remove egg cells from the mother's ovaries. They fertilize them with a sperm cell from the father. And they do this outside of the body in a lab, in a petri dish. They put the sperm cell into the egg cell. And then they allow it to divide a couple of times, to go through the first few mitotic divisions, and then they have an embryo. That embryo, they then take and implant back into the woman's uterus, where it will hopefully attach, implant, and she will become pregnant. And she'll have a normal pregnancy and give birth to a child. Now they can use her own eggs, and they can use a sperm cell from the father. Sometimes if a woman doesn't have a father that she wants, she could have a sperm donor, donates a sperm cell, and they use that to fertilize the egg and implant it into the woman's uterus. Sometimes people have surrogate mothers where a woman's reproductive system isn't able to support the embryo and fetus, but they can actually implant that egg in another woman's body, and she will go through pregnancy and give birth to the child. So there are all sorts of means of helping people to get pregnant. There's also artificial insemination, which can deposit sperm into the female reproductive tract artificially. And so there's lots of different ways they have of helping to treat infertility in couples. Forgot about it. If we look at these, this is obviously the very early stages of development in a very immature embryo. But again, what you see here is all the main parts are there, like we just talked about, the placenta, where blood from the mother and the fetus is very close by. We have the outer layer of the chorion, which forms that placenta, the inner membrane, the amnion, okay, filled with fluid to protect this embryo, and the yolk sac, okay, to help produce the blood for this embryo. So this is the very, very first stages of implantation. All right, we'll take a break, and then we'll work on that.